This can work too.
And we're live. Thank you very
Now we have
much.
no
mate.
choice.
Yeah. See, we were. Okay, to all the viewers there, we were debating how to start the pod. And I thought Zakes in mid-sentence was a good one. So welcome to the latest
Perfect
edition
choice.
of the Rational Standard Pod. A lot of stuff happening. The world is continuing to be crazy. Our government is continuing to be our government. I don't want to, denigrate the notion of craziness by saying that it refers to our government. But so this week, guys, we've had the budget, or did we? Will the budget actually be accepted? We're going to talk about the DA's reaction to the budget, some other parties' reaction to the budget. Have the junior partners in the GNU actually found their backbone? I'm going to talk about the rapid pathway to US citizenship for, sounds like, farmers in South Africa, or some farmers in South Africa, who knows which. And going to talk about the is it legal or is it not cannabis debate, or which cannabis is legal. Apparently the type that you smoke, yes, but the type that you bake into goods or gummies or whatever, not so much. So let's get started on the budget. Sakes, I'm going to start off with you because I know you have looked at the budget a bit. And
Yes.
I mean, Enoch Godongwana, your boy, Sakes, he took the criticism that people gave him of the 2% VAT hike, and he said, no, well, fair enough. We're not going to do 2%, but we will do 0.5.
5%. I mean,
Footnote, another 0.5 next year. But what's your take on the budget? Just an overview, Zakes.
Firstly, like, it is the more things change, the more things stay the same, isn't it? It is quite crazy, actually, when you think about it, that this man got a budget rejected like a couple of weeks back due to a VAT increase, and he went and sat with all of the smart people at Treasure and was like, you know what, another VAT increase. Another VAT increase, but a slightly lower one, right? And there were good ideas. I think our like the ANC specifically, because these are ANC ministers, right? And the ANC supports this budget. Like, the ANC is actively trying to sabotage our economy. There's no way to think about this, right? When the tax man is like, don't do that, because it won't work. It won't yield the results you wanted to yield, and they still proceed to do that. Instead, I guess now looking back at the initial reaction of Minister Godongwana's hot mic when he was talking about the tax commissioner, you now see that there's a bit of vindictiveness here, because the tax commissioner was like, no tax increases will help the revenue situation, and he was very upset. There's evidence of him being upset at the tax commissioner saying that, and then he comes back and raises taxes still, meaning that he does not care. He does, I don't maybe there has to be there has to be a real meaning to reasonability when it comes to the passing of laws, right? When you have the actual technical expertise of people who are employed in the state saying that you should not take a particular policy direction, and you still proceed to take it, that is unreasonable. That should not be allowed to be a thing, right? But given the nature of democracy, they will say that they were given a mandate by people, and as such, they should be able to do such things. But it is absurd to me. It is absurd. And the good thing, though, is that we are seeing, as you said, a backbone of the GNU partners, particularly the DA. By the way, I was from the jump that this was gonna be their biggest test outside of all the laws that were passed before they came into the GNU. This was their first real, they can do something to change it, right? Instead of just going to court, which of course they should do and they will do with things like the NHI, but those laws had already passed. But this one, they are saying no to it, and that's amazing.
Yeah, it's good to finally see an actual red line, being drawn and actually being enforced for once. Just the background there, in case our viewers didn't know, that was the head of SARS, Edward Kieswetter, who said that it would be foolhardy to increase taxes because we're over the so-called Laffer curve. So an increase in taxes isn't necessarily going to correspond with, or an increase in tax rates isn't necessarily going to correspond with an increase in tax revenue, which is something that we've seen. And if you guys are wondering how these sorts of decisions are made, Minister Godongwana actually told us. He told us it was the News 24 business budget briefing on Thursday. Mm-hmm. And if you're wondering how he decided on the initial VAT increase, here's his answer. He said, I plead guilty. I woke up one day and said, everybody has been attacking me for austerity. I'm sick and tired of it. This time I'm going to raise tax. Now, Martin, is that how countries should be run?
That is exactly.
Is sick and tired of people being mean to him, then that means taxes for everyone.
This is such a low point for Enoch Godongwana. Like, this is a guy I really had, like, I know he's a leftist, he's a statist, whatever. I had respect for the man. That's gone now, because what is happening here, he's lashing out like a child. He's lashing out like a complete child. As Zake says, his tax man tells him, do not raise taxes, it won't work. And he's like, no. The country tells him, do not raise taxes, it won't work. He's like, no. Many of the ministers in his own government say, we cannot raise taxes, it won't work. He's like, no. And now he goes to the News 24 business budget briefing, and then he lies. Austerity. He acts like over the last few years, he's been this hawk that has been cutting spending, slashing it, and it's falling. Like, the government is like so small, you can kind of drown it in your toilet now. It's like, and everyone is attacking me for having done this over the past few years. He's lying, and then he says, okay, fine. This time I'm going to raise taxes rather than cut spending. What a complete liar. This is sick. This is really, really sick stuff. And it's, again, it's in the same article. It's a News 24 coverage of that briefing that they did. Godongwana again complained about, and this is something that Treasury always does, is that, so Godongwana says, Jacob Zuma came to him in 2017 and said, we now have free education. And then Godongwana at other points has complained about, Motsoaledi comes and says we have national health insurance. And oh my God, I have to fund this now. And I've always found this shifting of burden from Treasury to be very kind of interesting, because Treasury they're the anointed. They are the ones who have been chosen to tell the government the hard truths about finances. That is the role that they exist for in our constitutional dispensation. So it's not like Zuma says, free education, we're doing it, fund it, or Motsoaledi says, NHI, we're doing it, fund it. It is Godongwana having to tell them, we cannot afford it. We are not doing it because the money isn't there. My tax guy says we can't raise taxes. The country is overtaxed. We cannot do it. The answer is no. This is something that people need to get far more comfortable with, especially if you are the Minister of Finance. You must say no. You have to say it cannot happen, banish the vote. But what is he doing? He is not doing that. So I've lost a lot of respect for Enoch Godongwana. I don't accept the premise that he's in a difficult position or whatever. He must say no, and if they don't accept his no, then he must resign. This is how it's done everywhere else. If someone does not feel that the government has confidence in their expertise and their competence, then they say, well, okay, I have lost the confidence of my government, I will resign. That is the appropriate response for a finance minister who is trying to bring about fiscal prudence and sensibility. He must resign if his government doesn't follow him. What is our finance minister doing? He's lashing out like a child at a business breakfast or whatever, and just lying, and just basically lying and pretending like we've had this history of austerity, of spending cuts, and now we're trying something different. Complete, utter lie. What's the word nowadays? Disinformation. It's disinformation.
Well, yeah, that is actually. I should give an update. In our previous episode, we expressed some skepticism around what exactly constitutes misinformation versus disinformation. And we did get a comment from one of our viewers who said that, well, we explained basically that the difference is that misinformation is basically incorrect information spread innocently, so not deliberately spread. So someone else created false information and you've spread it without intent, without, I suppose, malice intended. Disinformation would be the deliberate dissemination of incorrect information. But that does beg the question. Yeah. Well, that does beg the question. I mean, that might be the technical definition, and I know that is the technical definition, but it's just that nobody actually uses it that way. Nobody actually uses mis and disinformation that way. Most people, I mean, in the wake of the solidarity movement going to America and all that, it's not that people said, oh, they're spreading disinformation, which I think that's what they meant, that they were deliberately misleading the US government. They were saying the AfriForum Solidarity, all those people, they're deliberately spreading misinformation in the US. That's treason, which, I mean, deliberate misinformation is surely a contradiction in terms. But we've gotten off the point here. We've gotten off the point. The point is the budget and the disinformation by the minister. Just to give some of the viewers a background, when the word austerity, seeing as we're working with definitions, means an actual cutting back of government spending. So it can be a cutting back of government services. Usually it is if it's severe austerity, or it can just mean that it's a decrease in expenditure generally. That can mean either services, or it can mean capex, or it can mean infrastructure spend, or it can, in our case, also mean a cutting back of social wages and those sorts of things, or I mean the wage bill in general as well. When our government says cut, they mean last year we spent X. This year we thought we were going to spend X plus 10%, but now we're only going to spend X plus 8%. That means we've cut the budget by 2%. And that's just not how cutting works. That's not how that's not how any of this works. That's not, well, I mean, that is how government finances work. But I just think that people should know that when the government talks about cutting, they mean that we thought we were going to increase our spending by 10%, but we only increased it by 8%. So this is a fairly deep cut on our part. And it's sort of the equivalent of, we've got last month, I overspent my credit card by 10,000 Rand. But, this month, I'm really going to cut back on the spending, and I'll only overspend my credit card by 8,000 Rand.
8,000.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's real fiscal responsibility from my side.
Sure.
But yeah, so the whole point regarding austerity is fairly ridiculous. The budget in general, I mean, it's actually quite crazy. You can see this was a rush job. You can see that even some of the figures in the budget haven't been updated. And I was actually alerted to this by Davie Rood, who also had a presentation on the budget, or after the budget. And he pointed out that most of the growth projections actually haven't been updated since the previous budget. So previous budget was released before we got the latest GDP figures. But this one, we do have the latest GDP figures. So we know what growth in 2024 was. It was 0.6. But if you look at the budget, it still says 2024 estimate 0.8. So that's not been updated. Also, there's this weird assumption, or just laziness, which I think is probably the actual answer, or carelessness, that despite the fairly significant changes in the budget, that it has absolutely no effect on growth. So the forecast was 1.9% in 2025. It's still 1.9%. So apparently, changing that, allowing for bracket creep, allowing all those sorts of things, that's not had any impact on economic growth whatsoever. Whatever the forecast was, it's still the same. But so, I mean, I suppose it's not easy to do a whole budget, but there shouldn't be that the errors shouldn't be that glaring. It shouldn't be that obvious that large sections of the budget simply haven't been updated. But yeah, that's of course if
Because I
we're
don't care.
assuming that we do have a budget.
That is true. That is true.
And
And I hope that we don't.
yeah, well, tell us, Lex, what do you think? What's your
Yeah.
position in your political? What do you call it? The fortune ball thing.
Yes. The
I think
I don't know what is it called. Let's call it a clairvoyance ball. Yeah. But either way, my political clairvoyance ball, right? I don't think that the budgets will pass. There's too much opposition. There's opposition from the left and the opposition from the right, if you were to call the DA the right or the center, right? So I see Martin being like, but there's opposition from like multiple sides for this budget, right? There people on the left are like, oh no, the poor, and rightfully so, right? People who don't have a lot of income are the ones who are affected the most by increases in prices, which VAT will necessitate. So there's opposition from that side. I don't think that if the ANC wants to get support for it, it'll be able to get it from that side. And given the fact that the ANC has a lot of wealthy people, I think the only point they understood, right? Because like when you read, like there was a presentation that SARS did, and like they presented this entire study about how the increase in the wealth tax did not result in an increase in the revenue collected from that income bracket. So I think the ANC understands that. That is why they are choosing to increase VAT instead of increasing the wealth tax, which politically would lend them support from the left. They know because they've tried, but that's the same thing with VAT too, because VAT was just increased in 2018, right? And the whole point was to try and increase revenue and stem the rising tide at that time, which was fairly conservative of like this debt servicing cost. And now they've just ran away from us because in large part spending, as you've said, has not come down. Instead, they've just continuously adjusted down to the projected increases in spending year on year. By the way, projected increases in spending that were, firstly considered when the economy was growing at its height, right? When you think when the NDP was constructed, which is still guiding the ANC in large part, at least the so-called smart people among them, right? It was during the height of like the economic boom of Mbegi's time, right? Coupled with like an increase in commodity prices and all the good things that happened under Mbegi's presidency, and the bad things, of course, right? With the institutionalization of social welfare, and now we are dealing with the consequences of that, because now it can never ever come out. Instead, we are just seeing more and more of it. But I don't think that the budget will pass because, well, the ANC does not want to increase the wealth tax, so it does not seem like they will get support from the left through the VAT increase, and the DA seems pretty, adamant that it will not support any increase in taxes. And like I support that. I support that. The only parties, unfortunately, that seems to have supported this budget are like the IFP, which, and I know some other party, but the IFP was the most notable one, which is disappointing because why would you support an increase in taxes instead of just cutting spending? Like that is what we need to. That is what needs to happen. Cut spending. Tell the unions there's no money, no increases. And like, man, like I want to go on an entire tirade, right? Because every time we think of cutting spending and firing people, is that like we think there will be consequences in service delivery because we don't have a lot of people actually employed, right? We just have the few that are employed in the States are paid so much in terms of benefits and like salaries that it costs us a lot. And then when you bake in the increases that they negotiate year on year, it just makes it unfeasible. So it is in that regard a very like it requires a very strong will, right? Like an actual conscious renegotiation of salaries and the entire remuneration package of the state, because we need like people. I was hearing Godongwana saying that KZN needs teachers and nurses and things like that. Like we need those those people in the state if the state is going to be providing those services. And now, since the few that we have who are doing such a horrible job end up being paid higher than their counterparts all across the world, we are stuck in a difficult position. If we fire them, service delivery will tank. But we have to choose, really. Do we fire the critical services, or we eliminate social welfare like the SRT grant? but then we'll have to fight a whole bunch of, NGOs like I won't name right here.
Yeah, well,
Take the government to court.
yeah. Well, okay, Martin. NGOs might be the least of it. If I do actually agree that I think it's going to be very risky to actually cut that grant. I think a lot of people have become entirely dependent upon it, which
On
I
Earth,
guess
yeah, that's true.
I guess was the point uh, for a lot of these payments, is that
Yeah.
it's supposed to keep people dependent on the government. But okay, Martin, you seemed a little bit skeptical. Same question to you. Do we have a budget? Do we have sort of a budget? Is it going to change? Are the parties going to accept it? Because I hear what Zakes is saying. I think that the DA, having made this an issue regarding VAT, have made it very hard for other parties to say that, well, the DA might not be in favor of a VAT increase, but we are. We're not. They're more pro-poor than we are. But yeah, so that's the question: is do we have a budget?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I think firstly, I think it would be wonderful if this, what you kind of led in with Morné, was the case, that for the first time, probably in 100 years or something, Parliament is actually going to write the budget and send it to the minister and say, this is our counter proposal, this is what we're willing to agree to, and then they vote for that. I think that'll be a healthy flexing of Parliament's muscles. So that, I think that's what I want. The reality of what I expect is that we don't have a parliamentary tradition of doing that because it's never happened. Certainly not in the democratic era. And I don't think for most of the last half of the kind of apartheid era, that's either also not happened. So we don't have that tradition of MPs being independent actors, can you say, for lack of a better word. For to a large degree, they simply take, certainly from the government side, so that includes the DA, ANC, and all those, they take instructions from their cabinet colleagues. And if not that, then they take instructions from their head offices, and none of them have ever, the parties that aren't the ANC, really produced an independent budget. So I don't think that that sentiment is there. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I am on record as being very skeptical about the Democratic Alliance and its ability to kind of set the red line and stick to the red line. I think that there's a very problematic pragmatism in the DA that tends to, when push comes to shove, that tends to win out. So they might fight a bit, but ultimately the pragmatic consideration will win out. And this, I might be wrong, but my feeling is that behind the scenes, there's going to be a lot of threats now to the DA from the ANC specifically. That's going to come down to something like the following. If you do not approve this budget, we are going to propose a wealth tax, and then we're going to get the AFF and MK to vote with us, and then that is the end of the GNU, because that is what it effectively would be. If you reject the budget and you're not willing to compromise, and we're not going to arrive at a compromise on a budget, then the government effectively has now collapsed. That's how it works all around the world. I think that threats like that are now being, at this right now, being made against the DA, saying that you are playing with fire by not accepting our budget that we compromised on and that we had long discussions in cabinet over. You're compromising the longevity of the GNU. And if you do not come to the table, we will counter with a wealth tax, we will counter with an income tax increase, whatever. And we will get the EFF and MK to support us in that. And the DA will say, oh, dear God, please, just not that. And they will support the budget. That is my concern. I really hope I am wrong. I know a lot of people in the DA are very good liberals, very good free marketeers, and I hope that they have the oomph to kind of say, listen, stand strong, play the bluff, take their bluff, and stick with the red line. So yeah, I'm very concerned about the wherewithal of the DA in a real fight, and that's not me saying they're bad people, just that I don't think that in recent history there's been occasion for them to do that, where there's real stakes involved, like there are now. Very, very real stakes.
But what do the ANC get out of that threat? So I mean, the DA says no, you have to change the budget. What do they get from saying, what we're going to change the budget even more, and then so that we can get different partners? So I don't really see what the incentive there would be.
No,
for
so the
ANC.
ANC will not cut spending under any circumstances. This seems to me to be one of the hard and fast rules of ANC government in this country. The very notion of a real spending cuts, I mean, what they call spending cuts is like cutting, kind of taking a minister's credit card away or something, and they call that spending cuts. It's like, my goodness, what are you talking
They
about?
never do that. Banish the thought.
Yeah,
Oh, man.
I mean, but
The
to
last
them,
actually.
That's the very last thing they'd cut.
yes, yeah. But I mean, so ideologically to them, a cut in spending is like to a liberal kind of instituting concentration camps or something. It's like you just don't go there. It's just not even something that you can consider. So for the ANC, instituting a wealth tax that won't work and kind of getting in bed with the EFF and MK, which will be the end of Ramaphosa, that is less and less of a problem to them, I think, than actual spending cuts, which is the only other thing that's on the table. Remember, that's Godongwana with his false dichotomy of it's the SRC, the SRD grant, or it's VAT increases. It's like, no, dumbass. You have lots of shit that this government does and funds that you can cut. Yeah, like Gayton McKenzie's whole department gets 13 billion rand a year or something like that. You can just take Gayton and throw him out, and then that's 13 billion that you have in your pocket. You can go to the provincial there's many provincial departments. We heard recently from someone in the Gauteng provincial legislature that there's something like 800 people in the who work for the Gauteng e-government department. Now, what in God's holy name is the e-government department, and what does it do? And these people, I assure you, are well paid. Now, the central government can say, whatever that is, you do not get funding for that anymore. That's gone. So that's a few 100 million at least back in the central government's department. I can really just go on and on and on and on, and there will be more and more money that's available when you cut stuff that is not welfare grants, when you fire bad teachers, when you fire administrators, you sit around twiddling their thumbs. Like the money is there. You don't even have to cut taxes. The money is there if you just cut spending. So Godongwana is wrong about his false dichotomy. But the ANC is in principle opposed to cutting spending. And because it is in principle opposed to cutting spending, I think what it gets out of that, Morné, to answer your question, is that it remains ideologically committed to never accepting the premise of rolling back the state and taking the knock of a more inefficient wealth tax that Kiswater or whoever is warning them against, and potentially getting into some type of arrangement. I'm sure it would be confidence and supply rather than a formal coalition with the ANC, with the EFF and MK. I think they will see that as a lesser evil. So they will make that threat, but to just what I said earlier is that I think that there is still a measure of bluff in there. I think it is a bluff, because Ramaphosa, the man, knows that if he does this, his political career is over. And I think that he probably has enough sway in the ANC to say, okay, let's make this threat, because they know the DA will fall for it. I think the DA will fall for it, but they won't actually follow through. The ANC won't follow through with it because Ramaphosa wants to finish his term. So yeah, long story short, I think that's what they get out of it. But still, I think it's ultimately a bluff that must be called. Just if only for the credibility of the DA and its red lines.
Okay, well, a long answer. So as you balance of probability, which is more likely, budget? Does this budget as it is get accepted or no? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Budget as is. Okay. Zakes, what do you think? Budget as is or some adjustments?
Some adjustments. I think some adjustments are due. Like, even though I agree with Martin, right? Like the threat, I think when you just consider self-interest, right? Since it'll be a threat, so let's say the threat is made to the DA and the DA just holds the line because the DA has sold itself particularly with this, right? Like this was something even prior. This was the whole reason. Like no to taxes, right? And if they agree to taxes, it's something that they can control. They can't come back and say, "Oh no, but this was law that was already passed." Like it is suicidal for them if they capitulate on this. So let's have ideal scenarios. The DA does not capitulate. The ANC, as you said, cannot go to the EFF and MK because their leader knows that it'll be over for him, and he still holds sway. Actually, I think he's trying to. The reason he's reconstituting like the provincial structures, I think in Gauteng, in KZN, and in the Free State too, because I think he's trying to consolidate power because he sees how dangerous the creation of MK was to him. So I don't think that he'd want to, collaborate with them. And I also think the self-interest within the ANC itself does not want to see a wealth tax. Like those people want to keep as much of the money they stole as possible. So if that happens, then like their budgets will have to be reworked because the ANC is not going to be working with those parties. They could have done this a long time ago. Like the fact that they are seen to be working with, white monopoly capital in the DA is like just, detrimental to them in the optics and the voters who voted for MK, right? These are voters who left them and voted for the MK. So like they are comfortable doing that instead of working for MK because the self-interest within the ANC knows that like should they work with MK, then the MK's entire mission is achieved, right? Like they went out of the ANC and then the ANC came back into them and they subsume it. And who knows, in a couple of years' time, you might see Mr. Zuma as the president again, right? So that would be a no to the ANC. So I don't think that the budget will pass as is. It will have to be reworked. And as you said, I like Martin mentioning the whole false dichotomy thing. Like, man, that is messed up. What the finance minister is doing and saying that it's either you lose teachers, schools, and doctors, or we raise VAT. I'm like, well, no, those should not be the two choices in a 2 trillion rand budget, right? Like that cannot be the only like choices. But he's making it seem that way, which is a very malicious thing in my estimation, because it just shows that he does not genuinely care about this thing. He just wants to push through his idea of what is right, irrespective of like the consequences it could have. And like to Morné's point, they don't even think about these things, right? They drafted a new budget and they did not change the projection, numbers, meaning that they did not calculate the impacts that this new budget would have on like the economy. They could not even hire a PhD student to run a model to them, and so that they could get that. And like I'm like, man, these are people who are responsible for everyone's economic lives and don't seem to know what they're doing.
It's simpler than that. You don't need a PhD student to tell you what last year's growth numbers were.
I'm like, I mean, someone technical, right?
Complicated model
for the projections for something. I know there's a hungry PhD economic student somewhere who's like, man, I would give everything to work for Treasury and build a model for them just so to tell them, how the new budget could impact, growth rates in the coming year using the available data, of course. But they don't they don't even think that far. They aren't even concerned about that. I'm like, ooh, that is concerning because whatever is in that budget tells me that it's not pretty well thought out. But still, I don't think that will pass. I really don't.
Okay.
I hope it does.
I see there are some questions in the chat. We sort of alluded to this, but I don't think we really explained it very well, or maybe not well enough. The way budget actually works, and the way it works in most of the world, but how it hasn't worked for the past 30 years in South Africa, at least, is that the executive doesn't just get to say, so here's the budget, just letting you know, and then Parliament says, okay, cool, go right ahead. That's how it has worked in the past. But seeing as we're now in a position for the first time where the executive branch doesn't also have a majority in Parliament, or at least you don't have a pure majority with one party controlling both the executive and the legislature. The way that it actually works and the way that it's supposed to work in our constitution is that the executive, so the people in government, they give a proposal of a budget to Parliament. Parliament then looks at the proposal. They have an option to develop their own fiscal framework, which they then approve. But the point is, the people who control the purse are actually Parliament, not the executive. So in the past, and you can be forgiven for thinking this is how it works, but in the past, it's always been the case that whatever the Minister of Finance said the budget was, it was just going to get a rubber stamp no matter what. But
If I can just add to that, Morné.
Yeah, just go for it.
So just kind of from a technical legal perspective, the what we call the budget and so on is just basically the minister presenting a bill to Parliament. So how this system works is our semi-parliamentary, semi-presidential system works is that a minister in government wants something done. He has a bill written, that department has a bill written, and then they present that to Parliament. Parliament considers it and then votes for or against it. So that's how it works. And the budget is no exception. We make a bit of a spectacle around the budget because of how important it is and how transcendent across all kind of aspects of the government it's relevant for. But ultimately, what is underneath the budget speech is something called an appropriations bill. So that's every year Parliament adopts an appropriations act for that year, and that is basically just an act of Parliament that sets out the budget. And just like with any other bill, Parliament can chop and change it and make suggestions on it. So yeah, the executive has no unilateral authority here. Although as Morné said, and I mean this has basically risen to the level of political convention, and that in some way makes it a legal reality, and that is that Parliament tends to defer to the expertise of the executive on a lot of these things. But legally, Parliament does have the authority to intervene and change the bill before they adopt it.
Well, yeah, it's not actually intervening. It's I mean they're the ones who actually approve or adjust the bill. So it's not even the case that they're intervening. It's that this is their responsibility. It's just that they might actually for the first time do it, and that's why it's an open question. And seeing as nobody asked me, I'll still give my answer. I don't think that I don't think that the budget will be accepted, at least not in its current form. I think there will be some adjustments. I don't necessarily think those adjustments are going to be positive. I think there's a good chance that we might see some negative adjustments, things we might not like, because, well, that's just the way our parliament is constituted. But yeah, I think it's, at this stage at least, it's more likely than not that the budget will be adapted slightly, even if it is just to find a way to get rid of the VAT increase. That's my sense at the moment. That's my feeling, is that, and I think if that is the case, then it would be a fairly big blow, I think, to the ANC, and a fairly big boost to the DA. I think that would actually increase their credibility, particularly among the poorer demographics. So it's the ANC, for all the credit we give them for being these brilliant Machiavellian political operators, have sort of painted themselves into a corner here where they're almost the only party in government right now that's proposing anti-poor, quote unquote, tax increases, and everyone else is saying no, you shouldn't do that. So if we can find a way if the parliament can find a way to do the budget without that, then I think that's going to reflect very badly on the ANC. But yeah, I just want to, on that one point that Zach was making there, our government spends over 2 trillion rand every year, and the VAT increase, they're looking for, what is it, around 14 billion. So
16
billion. 16 in the first year, and it's 14 in the first year, 16 in the second, whatever.
Okay, yeah.
But the point is that that's fairly small potatoes in terms of the larger budget. The notion that there is in a 2 trillion rand budget, in fact, let me give you the exact number, it's 2.6 trillion rand budget. The notion that we couldn't find that small of a cut somewhere is simply ridiculous. And I just think that people need to recognize just how much money our government spends every year. I don't think people realize the absurd figures here. Think of the largest companies you well, certainly the largest South African companies, and think not what is their market cap, not what's the company worth. Think what the company spends, because this is spending, this is expenditure. So think what Naspers, which is the largest company in South Africa, what they spend in a given year, and you'll see that it's a pittance in compared to what our government spend every single year. And I think that we've all noticed that it's not necessary. There's no correlation. In fact, there might actually be a negative correlation between an increase in spending and an actual delivery of services. At least in South Africa, it's the more they spend, the worse things get, and
No, exactly.
it's not going to get any
That is
better
true.
when they
Yeah, that's
tax
true.
more either.
No, I mean one of
Yeah.
the heaviest fund. Okay, so outside of ESCOM and so on, one of the biggest funded institutions in our government is that pillar of excellence called the Road Accident Fund, and that alone could have, if you just said, if Godongwana, the great fiscal hawk, just went to the Road Accident Fund and said, "Listen, guys, you are in complete shambles. You have been in complete shambles for years now. You're done.
Forever.
It's over. Yeah, it's done. Like it's over. It's done. You're done. You're closed. We're closing the doors. We're putting kind of chains through the doors and we're locking it. You're done." That would have, I think, gone at least halfway to covering that 16 or 14 billion, at least for this year. That's a huge sum of money. That doesn't come anywhere close to anyone's social grants. So yeah, I'm intensely frustrated by that, by false dichotomies in general. I mean, the first one was it's either DA-ANC or ANC-EFF. It's like, you have to choose. It's like, but now we have it again, and our government does it so brilliantly. Our political class does it so brilliantly, presenting these false alternatives to us when we should insist. And I mean, the Free Market Foundation has long insisted, and people who've written for Rational Standard have long insisted, that actually spending cuts are good. We do it in our daily lives. We match our expenditure to our income because we are responsible, and that principle also applies, and perhaps applies even more to the state
More
because it is
facade.
stewarding money that does not belong to it. So yeah, it's a very frustrating kind of situation. And I mean, Morné, I don't know if we were going to bring this up, but at that same budget breakfast thing that Godongwana spoke at, Edward Kieswetter was there, and he was complaining that in South Africa there's at least 100,000. I think he's estimating there's 100,000
Up
people.
to 100,000.
Yeah, up to 100,000 people that earn more than R1 million a year that are not registered for tax. Now, my initial thought is that, well, not all heroes wear capes. When I think
Yeah,
about this,
I mean, not
yeah, but
not all heroes wear capes indeed.
yeah, unless some of these are members of parliament who voted for tax increases, then they should be arrested. But the question, I mean, it's a moral question. It's like, at what point do you see that the taxes that you're paying, not only are you not getting bang for buck, but you are actively funding criminality? Like like, as you alluded to, Morné, it's like the more you spend, the worse it gets. I mean, between 2014 and 2019, the Institute of Chartered Accountants estimates that we lost 1.5 trillion rand. The state lost 1.5 trillion rand in those 4 years, in those 5 years, just to kind of corruption and kind of wastage and so on. That is, and it's you're funding criminality. You're giving money to people to go and kind of buy big cars and go on a holiday in Singapore. So at
Maybe
what
they
point
should have
do
checked
you?
the couch.
Yes, yeah, check the
Seeing
couch.
as
But
the
at
money
what
is just lost, I don't know.
at what point do you, as a taxpayer, get to say that I am not going to fund this? And that's what I think a lot of these 100,000-ish people kind of, I mean, self-interest is always an important consideration, but I think it would be far fewer than 100,000 if in South Africa, when you pay taxes, you got bang for buck, and you didn't see politicians living lavish lifestyles, not just politicians, civil servants living these lavish lifestyles when the services that they're providing are totally collapsing. So without those things, you would have had more people registering and paying taxes. So the question, and this is I alluded to this a long time ago when I wrote about the excuse of just doing your job. I mean, we rejected this at the Nuremberg trial is almost a century ago. You cannot say that when you know that what you're doing is evil. And that's my message to Edward Kieswetter. It's like, you have a responsibility to go to your colleagues and tell them to stop stealing. You have to go to them and tell them to stop stealing before you come to us and complain about us not paying all the taxes that your heart might desire. Like, there's a sequence to these things. When they stop stealing and when they start delivering the services we pay for, then we can talk about the tax morality and tax compliance in South Africa. My goodness. I mean, this should be simple stuff.
That is true. That is true. Sorry, Morné, to your point, right? I was remember that report I was reading on the World Bank, and like they made the specific point of what you made of how we actually spend more money in like our quality of life indicators, from health outcomes to life expectancy, to educational literacy and numeracy levels go down. Right? It is it is actually one of the craziest phenomena. Hopefully someone out there will write a paper about this, and like I'd like to actually see a much more detailed analysis of it. Like it is baffling that you would spend more on something and it would fetch you less and less results.
Yeah,
But yeah, that to me is funny. That to me is funny, and the fact that like it does not even register to these people that just continue doing the same thing. It is interesting to see. But like I like what Martin is saying about the where do we start, right? Like those 100,000 people, man. Those are some amazing oaks right there, right? Like if you can escape the tax man as a millionaire, but I think when you're wealthy, it's much more easier to like devise ways to escape the tax, which is what is always said about increases, things like wealth taxes and stuff, like, or general increases in income tax. When people advocate for them, like, man, this will disproportionately affect someone who's in the working class, who does not have the resources to hire the best tax accountants to help them escape as much tax liability as they can. But you in your head, you think, oh man, let's tax the rich, and you think the rich are dumb. So shout out to those people, but they definitely should start at the leakages, right? It's like trying to fill a bucket that has holes in it. It is pretty absurd. You first start by plugging the holes, then you can consider filling more of the buckets. But to plug the holes then would mean that making enemies. Already Edward Kieswetter has made enemies out of the finance minister. I hope not. I hope no. I hope it was just normal wrangling. But and he said don't raise VAT. So if you were to actively go to every department and send out a memo like, here's the amount that the Auditor General said that was lost to you through like unaccounted expenditure, and stop doing that. So before you get any more funding, try and recuperate that. If you were to do that, he would be public enemy number one.
but Sykes, Edward didn't know that people were being mean to Enoch. He didn't know that he was sick of being criticized for austerity. So I mean, how can you not do it then?
Fair.
Yeah, just to fill in a couple of details there. So the theory basically on government spending in economics is that because government is more likely to spend money than the general public. So in economics, they talk about the marginal propensity to consume. So you get your salary each month, you spend a certain proportion of it, you save a proportion of it, and you invest a proportion of it. When it's government, they spend all of it. Oh, yeah. Well, yes, in our case, yes. So when it's government, they spend all of it. So the theory is that when government spends tax money, there's a sort of a multiplier effect, because it's the same amount of money in the economy, but more of it's getting spent. In South Africa, and that's what that World Bank report found, and actually a few other reports as well, was that our government is spending money so poorly that the multiplier is actually negative, that they're spending all the money they're getting, and they're spending it so inefficiently that it would have been better if they had just taken the money and burnt it. That it would have been better if they continued to tax, but just didn't spend it, or spend it to pay off debt would probably be the best thing. But well, the very best thing would be that they just don't take the money. So that's the theory on the spending, and that's why our government has clearly been very poor at spending. And you can see it when you look at the most funded departments in government. It's education on the one hand, which is amongst the worst in the world, and health, which is also our public sector. Our public health sector is atrocious, and everybody agrees. So the two things that everybody agrees is very bad are the two things that government spends the most money on. So that should just, without any theory, that should just convince you that clearly something's going on here. And just so everybody understands, when we say that civil servants are overpaid, there are actually some data to support that. There have been studies done, and comparing South Africa versus in particular the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's a lot of developed economies. Comparing us to them, we are a top 10 country when it comes to the proportion of the labor force that works for the state. So I think we're around 6th or 7th, depending on the way you count it, in terms of the proportion of our. So it's around, let's say 19-20% of the employed people in South Africa work for the state in some capacity. So that might include state-owned entities and stuff like that. So that puts us at around 6th or 7th. When it comes to compensation, they were way above the average. They were closer to 2nd or 3rd. I think it's only country. I think it's Norway. It's either Norway or Finland. It's one of those Scandinavian countries where government service do actually operate. But never mind that. But the point is that we've got already quite a large state employment sector, but we've got an extraordinarily well-funded state employment sector. So they are amongst the best paid public service employees in the world. And I think maybe we should do a poll on whether or not we think they're the best performing government sector in the world. I have my suspicions, which I don't think I need to say. But yeah, anything else on the budget? I think we've all said that there is no budget. So that means we're probably going to be sitting here in, I don't know, a month's time and say, what about the new budget?
Version 3.0. Yeah.
This time it's pissed off.
I hope we do see a 3.0. I hope we do see a 3.0. If not for nothing, right? Just for the instance of it, right? For like
just for the roles.
Just for vibes, like just reject this. Since we've already started, how about a 4th budget? How about no funding for the state and like everything kind of shuts down, huh?
Okay, well, that's an idea.
It's just the best idea.
Oh, Martin, yeah, I think you're either on mute or there's something wrong with your mic.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Have you plugged something?
Yeah, probably your mic.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, well, that's not the CIA. That's
yeah. That's definitely not some spooks trying to stop us from spreading the gospel of liberty.
Definitely not. Okay. Oh wait, he might actually be on his way back. But yeah, Zakes.
Cool.
I'm happy. Have you, Martin? Are you back? No.
Ooh, nope.
Suppose he is technically back.
Yeah, I mean.
Okay, let's give Martin a moment to sort out his mic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh wait, there you are.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So what I was saying,
with
what I was
bated
trying
breath,
to say,
Martin.
was that that's an interesting question about whether kind of let's say everyone is stubborn, which would be awesome, but no budget gets passed, and the ANC never kind of accepts a revised budget from Parliament. What happens then? The Americans call this like a government shutdown. It sounds far better than it is, but we don't actually have I don't think we have legislation that says precisely what happens. Morné, I think you mentioned that there's a small percentage, a very small percentage, that the government gets from the previous year's budget. But I mean, I think it's something like 45%, which I think, I mean, that would be a dream. 45%, that's kind of 55% cutting. It's that would be, yeah, the ANC would never go for that. But ultimately, the question is, if Parliament basically says we control the power of the purse and we are denying you the purse. Someone asked Grok this question because there's no clear political answer, but there seems to be a thinking that it would have to trigger an election at some stage, because if you can't fund the government, then there would have to be a reconfiguration of parliament, that is willing to adopt a budget. And I mean, this could be interesting stuff. So if there's some kind of good political operators in parliament, and they would be asking themselves this question: is it like, do we want a second go at last year's election? They would use this as an opportunity.
Well, I suppose there wouldn't technically need to be a new election. There could be a vote of no confidence in the president, and then he could, Parliament could install a new president in his place, and that president would be free to constitute a new cabinet.
I guess the question is that if Parliament is simply, whoever you get to be the president, if your Parliament, the various parties that comprise it, cannot, over more than 50% of them cannot agree what the budget has to be, then you have a problem. It doesn't matter who the president is. And yeah, the Constitution certainly doesn't tell us what happens then. It seems to me that if that happens for long enough, at the very least, there would have to be an election. And yeah, I would say that's something we're thinking about. I think it's a last resort, but it is something we're thinking about when you have this mentality of, it's a long-term unsustainable mentality that spending cuts are verboten in principle. You cannot govern a country with that mentality, and we have been governed like that for at least 30 years now. At some point, it's going to have to come to a head.
Actually not. And I was thinking about this when you said that the ANC are ideologically opposed to cutting spending. They actually did. The debt to GDP ratio in the initial Mandela-Trevor Manuel regime went down dramatically. And even under Mbeki, debt to GDP went down slightly and then sort of stayed constant, but at a very low level, at around, would have been around 30% of GDP or something like that. It was really only after the 2008-2009 GFC that the debt to GDP really ratcheted up. And ironically, so just again making the point that our most prosperous times were the times where we were not spending.
But was that
our least prosperous times were the times where we actually
was that really attributable to spending cuts, or was that to very favorable or more favorable economic environment that led to more kind of higher tax efficiency and so on, or was there real tangible spending cuts? I don't know. I was a young'un back in those days. So
don't pretend that I'm old. No, wait. I am actually the oldest person on this call right now, but not by much.
Yeah.
No, look, the cuts or revenue thing. Remember, fiscal policy is always the spending in relation to revenue. That's what fiscal policy is. So if on the sort of standard Keynesian view, if you're going through a slump, then the Keynesian prescription is that you use fiscal policy to address that. And using fiscal policy means you either increase spending in relation to revenue, holding revenue constant, or you decrease revenue whilst keeping spending constant. But the point is, you're supposed to either pump more money into the economy, or if the economy is booming, you're supposed to actually cut back on that, so increase revenue in relation to spending. But the point is that fiscal policy is all about the relation between those two. It's not just about spending. It's not just about taxing. It's about how much are you spending in relation to how much are you taxing? And I don't think people always consider that. So if you're actually just increasing spending in line with whatever is happening with revenue, then that's no change in fiscal policy whatsoever. That just means that you're keeping it constant. And that's why you can't say that Godongwana has spent money on, has cut the budget in any significant way, because fiscal policy has been the same. The revenue went up with 4 or 5%. Spending went up with slightly more than that. So that means the debt got more, but it also means that there was no real change. The ratio between spending and revenue stayed more or less constant. But yeah, the point is that, and I don't have the figures here with me exactly. I could probably look it up right now. I think that at 94, our debt to GDP would have been around 70, 80%, almost where it is now. And it definitely got as low as the mid-20s in the 90s, early aughts. So it has been done before.
I mean, my question is more like the point I made about the ideological kind of commitment of the ANC essentially to the developmental statist model. My question is less about technical kind of the fiscal policy definition of spending cuts, but more to do with, was the government doing something? Kind of, did it have people doing things that Trevor Manuel and his immediate predecessor decided that the government is no longer doing that thing, and that office is now closed, so it's over. Did that happen? I mean, that would be very interesting. I mean, I think we all had a sense that Trevor Manuel was a relatively relatively emphasis kind of fiscally prudent person, but yeah, I would be surprised if that's something that really happened.
Well, it did. I mean, because remember the baseline that they were working from was the previous NP government, the National Party government.
Where
people don't realize just how statist the NP was.
Yes.
So working off that baseline, there was actually incredible liberalization.
Yes.
In those initial years, and that's the ridiculous thing, is we're just clawing. Well, what's the opposite of clawing back? We're just falling back into the old system. So I mean, at 94, we decided that we're going to liberalize a lot of these industries, including something like education. There was a very explicit, when the Schools Act was adopted and the initial Bala Act, the Basic Education Laws Act, it was explicitly stated that in the past, these things were entirely controlled by the state, and and that led to indoctrination in that area. So that's why we're going to empower SGBs, and we're going to empower communities to control these things and to take it out of the hands of the state, which makes it so ironic that that we're going back to the old system that we explicitly rejected initially. So if the question is this Mandela's party, then the answer is quite clearly no, because we're rolling back legislation with the exact opposite motivation than what had previously been the driver of the change.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's everything on the budget. I hope everybody feels sorted now. And another thing, and actually, Martin, I think you're the one who flagged this one prior to the chat, so I'm going to hand it over to you. But that's on cannabis, on marijuana, on ganja. I know Zakes is our expert when it comes to the practice, but I'd just like you to give us the theory.
The nota. Actually, I was writing an article. I just finished right now before the pod. I was writing an article for the past 2 days actually about this very issue. I'm sure Martin's going to talk about the new regulations.
No, please, you take over.
Great then. Great. So the Minister of Health, who can call him a regular health czar. It's nothing personal, Minister, if you ever do see this, but your actions are something else. But the Minister of Health passed new regulations, I think last week Friday, that which banned the commercial sale of any products that are infused with any form of cannabis. So indica, sativa, and any strains whatsoever. So food products, because he had used the food disinfectant, some old food regulation, legislation, and the powers there that empower him to make regulations about that stuff. So he made a regulation which pretty much criminalized an entire industry in the dealing of cannabis. And like, man, this is wild, because he did this in before, whilst the government was looking for sources of revenue, whilst he knew that the executive he is a part of is looking for money for sources of taxes, and he criminalized an entire industry. For what? For last year, the government passed the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act, really, which was a bill, a highly problematic act. And I wrote an article about it when it passed, right? Because even though it satisfies the requirement, because the state only did it because the constitutional court instructed them to do it 2 years before, and they did it, of course, in the last possible minute, having the most horrible of provisions. But the most problematic of them all is that it does not make it legal to engage in any commercial activity relating to cannabis, but it makes it okay for you to be in possession of it and cultivate it. So now the question is, how do you get this? Do you have to, because any possession of you with it outside of your own private area is still an illegal act. You cannot sell it because the act does not make provisions for the commercial sale of the cannabis plants. Instead, it just pushes the provisions of the commercial activity to some other department, I think, maybe trade and industry. I don't know. The legal environment has been pretty crazy. And I know quite a few people who have cannabis clubs, around Johannesburg. And every time I talk to them, they tell they operate within this gray area, because the only legal mechanism that is there for the legal sale and distribution of cannabis, just like the plant itself, is through the medical licensing aspects of it, and that is wholly controlled by the Department of Health. And even that has problems too, because that is only limited to people who have medical conditions, and you have to have a doctor's note. But if you have been around any cannabis club or really any cannabis store around the country, you would know that it does not take a lot to get a doctor's note saying that you need cannabis, medically. So the problem was from the act last year, and then this year, the Minister of Health seemingly does something that invalidates the act that was passed last year. Because the progression was supposed to be, we are moving towards more liberalization, more deregulation, decriminalization, because companies have invested in this in this industry. And now the Minister of Health comes and says that, oh yeah, if you have managed to buy any capital or managed to start a business that deals in products that are infused with cannabis, that is illegal.
But Jakes, isn't he kind of so? One might say that, okay, cool. So the Constitutional Court said that you can use cannabis in private and so on, and we were not legalizing the trade. And the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act says you can't trade in it. So the cannabis trade is still illegal. But what is clearly legal in South Africa is that you can grow your own cannabis plants in your backyard, and you can use it alone, kind of in private or in your personal space or whatever. That is clearly legal. But the regulation that Motsoaledi, the dumbass, adopted says that you're not allowed to manufacture any foodstuff containing cannabis. So it's not that he's just using the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act to kind of control the trade in cannabis or to prohibit the trade in cannabis. He's actively telling you that you're not allowed to grow it in your own backyard and then to put it in your own food. Which to me, as a kind of I don't know, a non-practicing lawyer, says, I mean, it's a direct contradiction, not just of the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act, but of the Constitutional Court judgment that said you are in your own home, in your private space, allowed to use marijuana recreationally or for any other kind of reasonable purpose. So I mean, what the hell is this guy doing? This is ridiculous.
That is the question, right? I guess the answer from his part would be that he's not, necessarily decriminalizing its use privately. It's just criminalizing its sale. So any commercial activity related to it. So that would be the defense that, oh no, you can still infuse your own food in your own home, getting a plant we don't know from where. Like that is such an important part, man. Like it's useless the law if you cannot possess the plant outside of your home, right? It really such as a sad use of like how legislation undermines like actual court judgments. But I think his defense would be that like we aren't banning you infusing it in your own home, but you just banning its sale. That like any cannabis infused product, you cannot sell those whatsoever, and that is still bad. That is still horrible. Like I want to mention this. I'm sorry, Martin. Cool, Morné. You can go through before I talk about the master plan.
Okay, well, maybe this will get you on that anyway, because my question is, let's assume you're right. And I do think that is the interpretation of the Act, is that, of the regulations, sorry, not of the Act. And it is the case that it's free, you're free to use it. It's been decriminalized, so it's not as like it's a criminal offense. You are free to use it, you're free to infuse it, you just can't sell it. You just can't have any commercial activity where it's infused into a foodstuff, which is basically my understanding of the Act. Let's assume that's right. What would the motivation be? Why? I mean, is this? We joke about government making it illegal to do business in South Africa, but is this a case of them literally saying, we don't mind you using these products, or we can't stop you from using these products, as long as nobody is actually making money off of it? Is that how much this government is opposed to entrepreneurs? Is that we don't even care about the product, we just don't want anybody to prosper in any way? Is that, I mean, what would the motivation be?
It is crazy. It is crazy, Morné. It is crazy because the government knows the money that can be made, right? As I mentioned earlier, like in 2021, before the cannabis for private purposes bill was passed, there was a cannabis master plan that was developed by the state itself, by some committee in parliament, which mentioned all these great things. If this plant were to be decriminalized, would create over, what do they say, 200,000 jobs or something like that. The industry would be in the billions. The government itself says this. Like, this is almost crazy to me, because it means the health minister did not read any of this stuff. The health minister just was like, hey, I have the power to make it illegal to do business in this, right? And actively, and since we know that this would create jobs and generates revenue, it means, as you say, Morné, the government is actively sabotaging the prosperity. Imagine all those people who are employed in the sector, right? Like that is wild to me. And to Martin's point, I just read the regulations right now, right? Like the actual wording of the regulations mean they don't limit the criminalization or the inhibition to just selling. It means manufacturing, processing. So I think you may be right. It is an actual undermining of the court judgment itself, because manufacturing and processing can happen in a private sphere, right? And if it is legal for you to do that, then it means that the Prince judgment is just invalidated by these regulations, because, well, I can manufacture and process whatever I want if I'm not going to be selling it. So yeah, it's not limited to the state itself. So the defense of the regulations, should they be challenged in court, it will be pretty difficult. But yeah, Morné, man, the government does not want us to be rich, is the point.
No, so that's my concern. It says manufacture, and I know manufacture technically means you kind of make it like in a factory, kind of at large scale. But in the kind of the ordinary tongue, manufacture just kind of means you make it yourself. So it depends what the regulation defines manufacture as, or whether the Act itself has a technical definition of manufacture. But I mean, that aside, what you've just said, I mean, so the a master plan, I think that tends to come from trade and industry rather than from Parliament. So it's not just kind of one part of like it's another branch of government. And Zakhele was like, well, fine, Parliament has made a recommendation and I'll consider it. So maybe he's rejected that. No, it is literally the master plan was probably tabled to cabinet, where Zakhele sits and dreams about NHI, and it was adopted, probably with his vote in favor of it. Like, if I had to be a betting man, I would say that the ANC caucus and cabinet voted party line and said, let's do this thing. And now he's just doing this. Now, I mean,
although I think it would have been Joe Pasla, Dr. Joe.
Yes, well, I
at
mean,
that time.
Motsoaledi
So,
was his deputy at that stage, so he would have been kind of aware of it.
It was
But
in Home Affairs, I
it
think.
seems to me that this will just, I don't know, could this be another instance of the World Health Organization or some other entity being like, well, South Africa, you have to kind of just do this thing. I mean, like they do with smoking and alcohol and so on, even if it's so kind of inconsistent with your own constitution and the positions that your own politicians have taken over many years. I'm wondering where this could be coming from. It's not like
I
we have this idea that Motsoaledi is this anti-junkie kind of crusader when he himself is obviously someone who is permanently high on some kind of narcotic. So I don't know where this is coming from. So
No, on the authoritarian scale, Motsoaledi's always probably been the highest. So of all the entire cabinet, I think that in his stint, he's always been the one that's the most interventionist. I genuinely can't think of anybody who would have been worse. I mean, there are other people that are very bad, but I mean, he's a bit of a tyrant. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
That's the one thing. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, I really don't think you have to speculate about these grand theories regarding how policy is made in South Africa, because you can see that even the finance minister decides what that's going to be based on how he feels when he stands up in the morning. He just feels like he's tired of people criticizing him. So I mean, this decision could just be that, somebody phoned him up and said, geez, I just had a bad trip. He said, you're right.
Should do something.
Let's ban
or
it.
he had a bad trip himself. Yeah.
Oh yeah, the bad trip himself. He doesn't seem like that. Like if there's anything is high on, it's ideology. As Morné said, he's like, those are the people that always, in as much as I admire their commitment, right, to their ideas, they scare me because I believe in the opposite idea that they do. But he's like, who's this other Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, like really up there in terms of like, I know I'm right, and as such, I am gonna implement this because I know the state has the power to implement this. As I'll never forget her just outrightly banning cigarettes for no sane reason during the lockdown. She's the most high, like out of all authoritarians, she is authoritarian par supreme. And then
No
followed
sane
by
reason. What are you talking about? She had such a good reason. When you look this all and you pass it around, I mean, obviously that's such a kind of evidence-based, considered judgment on her part.
that is what I led with saying.
There's saliva on the paper.
Yeah. Of course, unless cigarettes are so. Let me not dredge up the trauma of COVID. And
the courts accepted it. I read those judgments, the Assawa judgment. There was one or two others where the court is like, oh no, the health department came and they explained to us why they did this, and we have to defer to their expertise. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just it was a crazy time. It was a crazy time. That is why I will never trust any health ministries in general. And that, like what Dr. Motsoaledi is doing, to me seems absurd, right? Like there's just no reasonable, like what's the basis for it? As you said, it is contrary to everything the South African government has been doing. In my article, I even mentioned about like he's passing regulations criminalizing an industry when the government needs revenue, and the presidency has come out and said that we need to deregulate. Like they have an Operation Vulindlela in the presidency where they're like, hey, we need to open up and make it much more easier to do business. Whether they are like sticking to that or not is out of the question, but it means that the ministers actively going against established policy positions of the past and current policy positions from the head of the executive, and saying, yeah, no, we're just gonna have an entire industry criminalized. Like, man, that is active economic sabotage, right? And it is considered okay. Should these regulations be challenged, and I hope that they will be, he will fight them. He will be, and he's very vocal in the media, so he will come out and put the most absurd of reasons, I'm sure, because I have not heard his reasons for them, and he will mention why these regulations should be passed. And it is unfortunate to me, like this like it borders on treason, right? When you are trying to like actively make it hard for people to like end an economic life, Should not be do that. Should not be doing that. You are literally employed to make it easier for me to be richer and live a comfortable life, and you are actively trying to undermine that. That should be the highest crime as a government official.
I just want to say that we've discussed so far the budget and taxation, which Martin compared to the Nuremberg trials. That was, and now we're
stand by
talking
that.
about regulations. And what's the comparison there, Zach? Did you say?
Treason. They're
Treason.
treasonous.
So
Yeah,
we've got
yeah.
we've got treason,
Well,
and we've got Nuremberg. And so maybe we're getting a little bit jazzed up, guys.
No. I stand by it. We have to. If history has any purpose other than some good bedtime reading, it is lessons that we need to learn. And if we don't take these lessons from the most lesson-rich periods of history, then there's no point to recording it. So no, I think the Nuremberg trials were. Not everything is genocide, of course, but there were some important principles there, and I think we sometimes tend to forget how absurd it is that we accepted when someone like Edward Kieswetter or someone like let's say let's forget about Kieswetter. Let's take Constable Smith during 2021 or 2020 coming to you. You're sitting on the beach. There's no one. You're sitting on the beach alone. You're not sick. You're peaceful. And here comes this policeman with his gun, his hand on his gun. And he's like, you have violated lockdown regulation. You are under arrest. Now, the media will say he's just doing his job. He's just doing his job. We can't criticize Constable Smith. Nonsense. Of course we can. Like the Nuremberg principle is you as an agent of state power must exercise good moral judgment to determine whether you are going to accept your superior orders. And I think that's an important lesson that we must apply, not just to genocide, although of course that is where it applies the most, but we must certainly apply it to our kind of daily interactions with the state. And I think Zakes' point about treason is a good one because, listen, if speaking to the White House is by itself treason, then I think kind of criminalizing people doing peaceful jobs, that certainly qualifies as well.
that should be treasonous, right? Yeah. To Morné's point, maybe I was just dumb, but there's the technical definition, right? If you are making it hard for people within a jurisdiction to actively sustain themselves through your policies, but this is the uber libertarian and who's like, man, legislation should not even exist, right? And there's a very sound argument for it. But if you're making it hard for someone who within a jurisdiction to actively support themselves, then you're actively violating their rights, like life, liberty, and property, like that. The whole idea of treason is committing a wrong against the collective entity that is the state. So maybe, it may be a stretch in legal realist terms to apply it to actual policy or regulation, because the normalization of the constant inhibitions to liberty that came about with the creation of legislation. But the principle is the same. And I think this is much more evident, especially in places like Africa, whereby you see the consequences of policy. You see the consequences in people's lives of what happens when someone in an office passes a particular law, and the actual effect it has on people just next door, right? All the decisions that were taken by Zimbabwean politicians actively led to, I know Zimbabwean in every South African city, and that is cool. It's great that they have a place to come to. So that to me should be the highest crime if people do that. But unfortunately, this is.
No, I'll tell you what. I don't think you were jazzed up enough. I'm going to step it up even more now. Where do we go from? It's not treason. We shouldn't be at Nuremberg. I think it's, I don't know. What's the next level? Transphobic? Is that?
It's racist.
Is it racist? But no. I think more seriously, I do actually agree with the sentiment. At least, I do think that people don't really think it through. Think through the implications of these sorts of things. I think that if you really did think through it all, and you realize that government messing up with these sorts of things and consistently messing up and clearly showing no real haste in fixing what they're doing, I mean, that has real tangible effects. When you talk about GDP stagnating and actually declining for almost a decade now, when you talk about 1.5 trillion lost to state capture, when you talk about not providing these basic services, people actually do they do have to bear the brunt of that. There are people that, because government's not doing its job, they don't have water, and that is it's more than just corrupt. It's more than just incompetent. I think it's fundamentally evil. I think it really is. And I think that if people thought about it clearly, then they'd be far more. I mean, Martin always says that, and I sometimes make a joke about it, but it really is true that people aren't nearly upset enough about the state of our government and about what they put us through, not just in terms of what they don't do, but in terms of what they do. So in terms of what they don't allow you to do, in terms of how they limit your opportunities, in terms of how they make it impossible for people to actually prosper in South Africa. I mean, that's a real tangible effect. And we're a country where there is genuine poverty. And I think it's because we work with these sorts of things every day, we can sort of forget about it sometimes. But we can become sort of jaded with that. But I do think that it is important to remember that there are people who are actually affected. In fact, all of us are affected, but there are people who certainly bear the most of the burden for the government that we have.
Yeah.
And on
could not
that,
have said it better, Morné.
Yeah, on that not so upbeat note, is any last words from you guys? We've been through the budget, we've been through cannabis, we've gone through Nuremberg all the way to treason. Somehow we always end up in treason. There should be a new rule for the internet. What's the old one? The one that Godwin's law, that any discussion on the internet will eventually end in a Nazi reference. And now we've also got given enough time, any discussion on politics in South Africa will eventually end up on treason. And I do see it in the comments section. I'm not just saying that.
Fair. That's cool.
That's
cool.
the bed that they're making. That's the bed that they've made for us. I mean, we didn't start the fire, but we're willing to take it from there. I mean, I guess, Morné, what's on our radars for next week? I guess we can give the listeners a taste of what we'll be looking out for from our beloved state. And even from what's happening around the world. We heard that Donald Trump has said, I think it's not policy yet, you never know, but that farmers can have a fast track to citizenship. South African farmers have a fast track to citizenship in the US.
A rapid pathway to citizenship.
Yes. Yeah, which is, I mean, we started with kind of asylum or refugee status for Afrikaners, then that became ethnic minorities, then it became farmers, and now we're from refugees all the way to citizenship. So there's a lot of craziness going on. Some of it potentially interesting and potentially exciting, but certainly crazy and kind of happening at a far quicker pace than I think any of us have the bandwidth for. This is something that will be. Yeah,
I'm actually just holding out for a cabinet post. I'm waiting for Trump to say that South Africans have a fast path, rapid path to citizenship, and they all get cabinet posts in the White House. So I'm holding out until I can take Secretary of State from little Marco. So
if they start now,
I'm still here for now.
If they start now, then in 100 years they could have a cabinet about as big as South Africa's. So
Pretty
Jeez,
much.
can you imagine?
Yeah. No. Trump seems to, at the very least, have adopted some even of the worst part of ourselves, right? Elon has managed to convince him to bet for his own private company. So we're seeing little inklings of state capture right there. So continuing South African traditions even internationally. So shout out Elon for making the president of the US endorse your own private company.
Yeah, that is
So
a
yeah.
bad look, isn't it? That's
it is all interesting in the land of the US. Yeah,
I'm
I
just
have
saying. I thought we were gonna get through a Zake's episode where you don't bash Elon,
yeah,
and
no,
everyone.
no, we can't, no, we can't. Especially no when he does something as easy to bash like this, right? My entire position just keeps on getting reaffirmed. I just hope that you'll get in like 5 years time and we'll look back and I'll be like, yeah, I told you also. I told you also that he's a scammer. He's as South African as they come, really.
Yeah, so we must be proud of our boy, man. He's
Yeah,
taking the
hey.
finest of the South African tradition to the US.
To the US. As I said, I'm not hating on them. I see it. He already has, the South African, the American president on speed dial, ready to do him any favor he requires. So yeah, and it must be great being American currently.
Let's say he's a mixed bag.
Yeah, but mixed bag of not so great things.
Okay, I'm not going to end on that.
Yeah.
But you'd think that the ANC would find, there's a fellow traveler. Here's someone who really
Right.
understands the way we think.
Mhm.
And we were actually talking about the reports from President Ramaphosa talking about the need to clean up Joburg. And the fact that he, for the first time, he actually noticed that maybe our economic hub doesn't look as nice as he'd like it to, with the with the G20 on its way. So for the first time, it's not as though that bothers us because our citizens have to live there. Who cares what they think? But if the G20 is coming over, just you don't want people from the G20 to arrive in South Africa to get to Joburg, and then there are all these beggars at the robots asking them for money. That's Cyril's job. Cyril's job is to be asking them for money, and he can't stand that competition with the beggars in Joburg. So that's why we need to clean it up. And
At least until the G20 leaves, Morné. Then things can kind of.
Then things can go
he doesn't have to
normal.
compete. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways,
And
guys,
he said he lived in Joburg. I'm sorry. That man is constantly surprised. He said he lives in Joburg, but he was surprised at how bad it is. I'm like, you don't live here, then. You don't live here. But
he is
that's
part of
cool.
Johannesburg, so I guess, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you can create a little enclave away from the riffraff, I guess you're cool.
yeah.
Hey.
Oh boy. Okay, guys, it's been fun. Thanks, and thanks to everyone who's watching. Thanks to everyone who watched it live. Thanks for the chat. We really enjoyed that. If you enjoyed what you saw, you share it, like it, subscribe. I think that helps us. I think that helps us.
It does.
Us grow the channel or something.
Yeah,
Definitely. I know how algorithms work. But so like it, subscribe it, share it, and even if you don't like it, still comment, because I think that's good. And and if you're worried because you've just taken some sort of foodstuffs with marijuana in, and you don't want to sound dumb on the internet, you can still comment. Why don't let that stop you?
No.
So in fact, comment especially then.
Yes.
And everybody remember, have a great week, and you don't hate your government enough, and make sure to stay free, everyone.
See you next week.